Hello friends. So today we are going to discuss these acts of 1853, 1858, 1861 and 1892. So far we have discussed in the historical underpinnings these acts and what these changes were brought by the British Crown or the British Parliament in order to control the affairs of the British East India Company. Okay. So in this series, in the last lecture, we have discussed the Act of 1833. So in this lecture, I just give you a recap of this act. It was the peak of the centralization, okay, and the head of the affairs, Indian related affairs, was the Governor General of India. That was William Bentinck. He was the first Governor General of India. Under him, a council of 3 members was there, and this was known as Executive Council. Okay, and the 4th member was added as a law member, means whenever the expert advice was needed to GGI, Governor General of India, this member will act as a member of the council, but remember, only in the matters of legislation. Okay, so this was not permanent and he had no right to vote. Okay, so this was the 1833 acts structure of Executive Council. And the most important thing was the all centralization was there, and all the powers of Bombay and Madras were now under the Bengal. Okay, so this was the peak of the centralization. Okay, so in this chapter we'll learn about the 1853, 1858 and other two, 1861 and 1892 act. So first of all we will discuss 1853's act. So far we have discussed all the acts with 2 themes, keeping in mind one was the admin, that was internal, that is how EIC was working, and the second was regarding territories, so territorial administration, right? So we are seeing these changes in these 2 themes. Okay, so in this act of 1853, so what was happened here, the court of directors were reduced from 24 to 18. So first we'll recap here. There were 2 in internal administration, there were 2 bodies. One was court of director, that was to be appointed by the EIC members itself, and they were 24 in numbers. Okay, so they will these members will see the administrative related things of EIC, and this BOC, board of control, was overall watching mechanism which was introduced by the Pitt's Act of 1784. Okay, so overall oversight mechanism was BOC, but how the control civil affairs or the commercial affairs were getting administered administrated with the help of court of directors. So these numbers were reduced now to 18, and here you can see how the British government is controlling now. These members are now 18, and out of this 18, 1/3, it means 6 members are now to be appointed by the British government. Okay, so this is how internal affairs were getting controlled by the British Crown or the British government. All right, now we'll see the territorial affairs, how territorial affairs are getting controlled. So first we'll see there was an Executive Council in the last act we have seen in the Act of 1833. There were 3 members, and the 4th member was not permanent, but he was there at the time of expert advice, and this was the GGI. Okay, so now GGI got, this was the Executive Council. Okay, so now one more council was created under him, and that was Legislative Council. Okay, with 6 members. So one new legislative council was added with 6 new members, and this was how you can see the separation of the functions, means executive functions were separated, and these legislative functions were separated with the help of this act. It means now onwards the legislation was also a kind of important work for the GGI. Okay, so and one more important thing is here, that is in these 6 legislative members, 4 members were to be appointed by the local government of Bombay, Madras and Bengal and Agra. Okay, so it was a kind of local representation was provided into the matters of legislations. So this act is known for its local representations also. Okay, and one more important thing is this was the legislative council. One more important thing was this executive council had 4 members, but fourth was not permanent. So here he get the status of permanent member with right to vote. Okay, so this became permanent member and with right to vote. Okay, and one more important thing was here introduced, that was the merit based civil services. It means now, that is earlier, before this act, the officers of the company were supposed to be appointed by the company itself, so there was no Indian participation. But now merit based civil services were created, and now the Indians can also join the hands in the administration of the company. So Macaulay committee was appointed in 1854 for or to ensure this participation, and there were also some new provinces created with the help of this act. Okay, so now the overall administration was looking like this. In case of internal administration, I'll say there were 2 bodies, BOC and COD. So now COD were 18, and out of them 6 were to be appointed by the British government. This is the internal administration. When it comes to the Governor General of India, okay, so he has now 2 councils. One was executive council and one was legislative council. So executive council had 4 members, while legislative council had 6 members, and this legislative council will be known as Indian Legislative Council, that is ILC. Okay, so this was the structure after this act of 1853. Okay, so now we'll come to the act of 1858, and that was that came after 1857's revolt. So this was act for the better government, as said by the British crown. So what was the main or major change was introduced here? That was the crown was now directly controlling the administration in the India. It means EIC was now only a trustee, okay, for the crown only. So one thing was this one, and the second thing was now Secretary of State was created. A post of Secretary of State was created. So it means this was SOS, Secretary of State. Now he will be responsible for all the Indian affairs. Okay, so all the Indian affairs will be controlled by this SOS, and this SOS was the member of cabinet in British government. Okay, so this SOS also had one council of 15 member in order to assist him. Okay, but this council had only advisory role. All the powers were vested in the post of Secretary of State. It means the internal affairs which were earlier under BOC and COD, okay, now they both were eliminated, and the only post which was created, it was SOS, Secretary of State. It means that dual system of this BOC and COD came to an end after this act of 1858. Okay, and the second thing would be here, this SOS will be responsible for the administration of India, but all the real powers vested with the Viceroy, and this Viceroy was nothing but the Governor General, which was named as a Viceroy from now onwards. He became the Viceroy. Okay, so this was how the changes were brought by this act of 1858, and the first Viceroy was Lord Canning, and this was all about the 1815's act, right? So we'll come to the next act of our 1860 act, that was Indian Council Act of 1861. Okay, so so far we have seen that there was a legislative council that was at the center also, and the provinces also. So Central Legislative Council or Indian Legislative Council. So under this act, what will be there? The non-official members will be increased. So what were the non-official members? So there were 2 type of members. One were officials and one other one were non-officials. non-officials. So these official members were to be appointed by the EIC only. Okay, but these non-official members were generally Indians or the local citizens. Okay, so these were the non-official members. So the very first thing here comes is that was the local representation was increased in the legislative council. Okay, number one. So some of the members like Maharaja of Banaras, Patiala, and Sir Dinkar Rao were given the representation into this legislative council. But this was no not that representative because they were to be appointed by the viceroy itself. So this was not a representative one, nor it was deliberative one. It had very limited powers, and this was how the very first thing comes here, that is association of the Indians in lawmaking. Why it was not deliberative? Because viceroy had a lot many powers. For example, certain bills need the prior consent of the viceroy before the introduction, or before they could discuss anything, that is to be get a consent from the that should have that consent of the viceroy. The second thing one that was viceroy can keep anything or any bill for the consideration of the crown. That was the kind of veto power which was with the viceroy. He had all the veto powers, means he can ignore the advice of his all legislative council and can bypass all their discussions. And the most important thing here was the ordinance making power was also with this viceroy. That is, in case of any emergency, he can bypass the legislative council and can bring a law for the period of 6 months at a time. Okay, so this was ordinance. So these were the changes at the central level, and the same changes like here in provincials happened. The very first thing came here, that was the decentralization of the power was started. So we had seen 1833's act, and it was the peak of centralization. Okay, so we saw that Bombay, Madras had nothing, had no power, especially in the matters of legislation, in the matters of revenue, and they have lost almost all of their power, and they were under the Bengal. But here they get their legislative powers back, and they this process of devolution had started actually, or the process of decentralization started. Same changes were there in non-official majority inclusion. Okay, members were there, but they had no power to vote. Those who were non-official members, they had no right to vote. And one more very important thing was introduced in this act, was portfolio system. Okay, portfolio system means some of the affairs were to be controlled by a particular member from the council of governor. Okay, for example, some of the one of the member is controlling all the matters related to the agriculture. So it was a kind of portfolio, agriculture portfolio. So this was the 1861's act, and how that was very important. So two things here you have to remember, that is, one is portfolio system, other was ordinance making came up with this act, right? So this was about 1861. Now we'll go to the 1892's act. So here first we'll see the background of the act, and in 1885 the formation of the Congress came up. The Congress was formed in 1885, and now they were demanding, at the time of this act, they were demanding the local representation, and that too with direct elections. Okay, but this act somehow introduced some members in the legislative council, or legislative councils were enlarged. Okay, but direct elections were not there. Instead of direct election, indirect elections were there. Okay, so this was the popular demand of the moderates, that we need Indian these legislative councils with large number of Indians, and with direct election they should be elected, but they came up with this indirect election method. So this was the beginning of the parliamentary democracy, because now they were getting selected into the matters of legislations. So what act, what was this act all about? The first thing was legislative councils were getting enlarged, numbers were increased, but the method of election was indirect. Non-official members were added. It means Indians were added into the Legislative Council. But the thing is, non-official majority was continued or retained into the matters, into the councils. Okay, so here we'll see a diagram. So there was a Legislative Council at both central and provincial level. So first thing was non-official members were increased, and that was indirect elections. So in case of center, the members were to be appointed by the members of the provincial legislative council, number one, and Bengal Chamber Commerce. So these members were to be appointed by these two bodies. While at the provincial level, same, the non-official members were increased. The method also was indirect election, but now they were to be selected or elected by the local bodies, jamidars and district boards. So this was how the method of election was there. That was indirect one. Although non-official members were increased, but the important thing is official majority was still there in both center as well as provinces. Okay, so this was the main change. And other change was into the matters of functions of the legislative council. So earlier we saw that they could discuss not many things, but they could discuss only some minuscule of the matters. But here now they can discuss and ask the questions to the executive, number one, and that too the matters of the budget can also be discussed and the question can also be asked to the executives. So this was the important change that was brought into the matters of legislative council's functions. See, this act was particularly important, seeing that this act had provided the opportunity to the Indians to be there into the legislative council, and because they were now in the legislative council, so now they can provide Indian point of view into the matters of the administration. So this was how that act was so important for the evolution of the Indian parliamentary form of government, or parliamentary or democratic country. In the future we will see in our next lectures how the changes brought to the parliamentary form of democracy into the India. Till then, goodbye. Jai Hind, Jai Bharat.